Dads, if you're struggling with discipleship and education, turn off the television. You don't need to watch 10 hours of football on the weekend. I don't watch football. I hardly watch any TV. And I find that helps me with my parental responsibilities and leading my family.
Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. I'm your host, Alex Newman, senior editor at the New American Magazine. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have a very special guest today. His name is Kevin Novak. He's a former homeschool administrator, the president of Deconstructing the Coliseum, Inc. He's also licensed to practice law in Texas and Virginia. He currently practices criminal law in Texas as a prosecutor. And before lawyering, he spent over 7 years in the insurance industry, and he has spent many years in Christ-centered ministry, going into the inner cities and in homeless outreach. He's a regular guest on some really phenomenal radio programs and podcasts, including some of the biggest ones out there in Christian world. He's a founding member of the Christian Education Initiative, which we've talked about on this program before. He's also done some extraordinary publications over the years, including a Reformation Without Tarrying for Any, The Future of the Free Exercise Clause, True Liberty in a New Media Age. Can your child be taught the truth in a public school? That's a good question. We'll ask Mr. Novak that. And finally, Abolished, Overcoming the Christian Establishment on Education, which is a book I happen to have here in my office. Kevin, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for having us. And I know one of your passions is Christian education. So let's start with the obvious question. Can a child be taught the truth in public school? Is that legal? Does that happen? If not, why not? And what should we be doing about it?
Well, thanks for having me on, Alex. No, your child cannot be taught the truth in a civil government school, and that's because they legally prohibit God from being the rationale for all thoughts. And we're talking here, of course, about generally liberty. We're talking about specific things like logic and mathematics and justice. If there's no God in those things, then they don't exist. And you probably talked on your show about pushing the antithesis with unbelievers. Can they even rely on things like logic and mathematics and empiricism? Now, these are other conversations, but if you're leaving God out of those specific topics and then something speaking more to the political civil government realm liberty, then no, the truth can't be taught in a civil government school. And I think that's relevant to well-meaning Christians who think, well, I'm going to go into the civil government school system as a teacher, and I'm going to be this kind of secret operative for, evangelizing children. I have some of those people in my church, and if they would be open to listening to me about it, I would press them on it and say, well, do you believe that you should not be breaking man's law? And if they say yes, then I would say, well, you're being a secret operative in the civil government school system is a contradiction. Now, in terms of going into the civil government school system and talking about truth, the prohibition on Jesus being the rationale for thought, I've always thought is arbitrary, because if liberals are going to say, well, Jesus is not the ultimate authority, then why wouldn't they allow him to be taught in civil government schools? So I think that speaks to the fact that liberals know that Jesus is the truth, and they overtly prohibit him because deep down inside they know, like Romans talks about, that they're just suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And what we do about it going long term is we need to abolish this civil government school system, because it shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about that. I think there's this kind of pervasive myth that the schools were at one time wonderful. They used to pray. They even had the Bible in there maybe once or twice a week. They come together for an assembly. And then somewhere along the line, evil liberals just hijacked them and turned them into the garbage that they are today. Talk to us about this process. I guess prior to the 1960s, before the Supreme Court stuck its nose in this, at least there was, some prayer, and every once in a while there'd be, a reference to, well, God created us and things like that. And of course, they could still at sometimes at least read the Declaration of Independence. Walk us through the process. How did we get to the point where it is prohibited for a teacher to explain some of these fundamental truths to children?
I was talking to someone yesterday at church actually about this, and they were pointing out to me that, wow, the public schools have gotten so bad lately. I said, well, that's not anything new. And I pointed out, a lot of us that deal with Christian education are fond of quoting A.A. Hodge and how he said, the civil government schools are the engine of atheism. And I think he said that in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, he was a theologian at Princeton University. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And so I said to my friend at church, I said, well, I'm not so sure that I would have been smart enough to recognize that 100 years ago, but I was just pointing out to him that, no, this is not something that's relatively new. Now, I will point out one of the things that I have found helpful, and although David Barton, I'm thankful for a lot of the work that he's done, he would disagree with me in that he thinks that the civil government schools are salvageable and that we should try to reform them. But I want to point out one of his books that I have, and that's called Original Intent. And he has some graphs in there that point out just quite easily. They're obviously visual, so readers don't have to do a lot of reading on this, but he does point out these Supreme Court cases that go back 50, 60, 70 years. And the Supreme Court essentially short-circuited the prohibition on God in the civil government schools. But before I came on, I was doing a little reading on even the Blaine amendments that go back to the 1800s. And the Blaine amendments were these amendments to state constitutions prohibiting sectarian education. But at the time, that dealt with Catholic education because there was a dichotomy in American Christendom between Protestantism and Catholicism. And the Protestants, still having control and authority over the civil government school system, were trying to prohibit the Catholics from influencing the civil government schools. But obviously, even lately, that got hijacked and now is being used against Christians. But there's a book by a guy named Hagedorn, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the title of it, but readers don't necessarily need to read the whole thing, but what he does is he chronicles the hundreds and hundreds of names of people that were involved with the development of the civil government schools going back to the mid 1800s. And, a lot of people like to quote John Dewey and Horace Mann, but there were hundreds and hundreds of people, if not thousands of Christians, unfortunately, that said, well, let's develop this civil government school system because it'll be taking dominion. But their faulty reasoning was that they thought that the civil government should have jurisdiction over thought and over discipleship and over K-12 education. And so you have a number of different factors, big factors, of course, but I think it goes back even to the 1800s where Christians thought, well, let's have the power of the physical sword, like the sword of Damocles, hanging over our children and the family government's head. And that was the faulty reasoning that got us into this mess that we're in now.
And so what do you think the Bible actually teaches on this issue? Who should be responsible for education? We've got about a couple minutes left before we go to break. And on the other side, I want to talk about, what the Christian establishment that you speak of believes. But what do you think is the proper biblical understanding of education and discipleship? Who should be in charge?
Well, it should be the family, mainly fathers. And I'll say something controversial, but I can do it because I just want to speak the truth. Dads, if you're struggling with discipleship and education, turn off the television. You don't need to watch 10 hours of football on the weekend. I don't watch football. I hardly watch any TV. And I find that helps me with my parental responsibilities and leading my family. So I think it's the family government. That's the original jurisdiction. Kerry Morgan just actually wrote a book on the origins of civil government. And he talks about, this is fascinating. I needed this reminder, but if we look at like the first, 10, 15 chapters of Genesis, it actually is about 1,500 years. And so I think his point is the family government is the original unit. And they're the ones in charge of education and discipleship.
Yeah, we've had a few people on this program who've made that same argument, just going through different Bible verses. And what you find is that the raising, the discipling, the educating of children is always, when it's mentioned in the Bible, it's in the domain of parents and family, not not Caesar, right? It's a very clear contrast there between those two. And yet so many American Christians today, without even thinking about it, just send their children to public school because, oh, that's what you do, right? That's what you do in America, government school. We're going to be going to break in just a moment, but when we get back, we're going to continue talking to Kevin Novak about what should be done about this and how to overcome what he describes as the Christian establishment in dealing with this problem of government indoctrination of our children. Stay with us. We will be right back.
As a lumberjack, my job is pretty straightforward. I see the wood, I chop the wood. We even hear crazy ideas on how kids should learn.
Visit thenewamerican.com.
Kevin, before the break, we were talking a little bit about kind of what mainstream Christianity in America believes and how they've kind of adapted to the system that exists in America today. Now, the subtitle of your book on abolition is about how to overcome the Christian establishment on education. So let's break that down. What is the Christian establishment and why do they need to be overcome when it comes to education?
Well, I was talking about abolition with my wife last night, and that's my favorite conversation. In fact, she makes fun of me because it's all I think about. And I told her, I generally do not get upset with liberals about education. That's because we know what to expect from them. The frustrating thing is on the Christian side, we could be winning, but the more high profile organizations, and I'll mention a few if you're okay with that. These are not
Sure.
Alex's mentionings, but mine. I would like to see Family Research Council come out and say the civil government has no God-given right to disciple children. I would like to see Leadership Institute say the same thing. I would like to see Answers in Genesis say the same thing. And I would like to see the Colson Center for Worldview say the same thing. I say that because those are leaders. Those are people who already are recognized by Christians as leaders in the Christian arena. And they're already the tip of the spear. If they would come out and say what I'm saying, they don't have to be mean about it or emotional about it. Just be biblical and logical. And if they were to come out, this would, I think, if I can, I don't want to speak on behalf of God, but this would hasten, this would short circuit a revival. It would be phenomenal. And so those are examples of the Christian establishment, but the Christian establishment are basically organizations and preachers who refuse to discuss this issue and get it out in the open so that we can make progress as Christians.
Yeah, I've noticed more and more people are now coming out and saying this just in the last few years. Even some non-Christian leaders, I mean, they may be, I don't know, Rush Limbaugh came out and several times said, you got to get your kids out of the public schools. Franklin Graham actually came out on Ted Starnes' show and said, talking about New Jersey, they had just passed this crazy LGBT brainwashing law and said, I'd get my kids out of public school, put them in a Christian school. We seem to be moving in that direction. Bodie Balcom, of course, has been preaching this for a very long time. That movie Mind Polluters featured the head of Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham, really boldly explaining the problems of public schools. So we seem to be moving in the right direction. Why do you think there is this hesitation among really, really influential, mega Christian leaders to come out? Because I think a lot of them know it deep down, right? But why do you think they're hesitating? You think they're concerned about backlash? Or they worry about people stop donating? What do you think it is that's holding them back? Or maybe they just don't believe?
Well, I'll tell you, I don't necessarily want to say it's money because I don't want to. I really don't know that that's it. I think a lot of it is embarrassment. But here, I wrote an article that was published. It was an op-ed for Western Journal. And the way I started the article was, look, I just got back from a homeschool convention. This is when I wrote the article. I said, I just got back from a homeschool convention in Austin. And over 90% of the people that came up to me, mainly women, said, we don't want vouchers. And I'm using that as an example because my point was there's a disconnect, just like there's a disconnect between Republicans or conservatives and the Republican leadership in DC. There's that same disconnect between Christians, American Christendom, and the leaders. And I think they walk around thinking the same things over and over again. They're generally older people. I'm not mocking them. I'm just saying they're older and they're stuck in this paradigm of saying, well, when I went to a public school, it wasn't that bad. I call that the footloose mentality. Oh, I dabbled in sin a little when I was younger, and the public schools are not that bad. And so they project and they think, well, it's not that bad. We'll send little Johnny there. I think Christian leaders are embarrassed, and they're not bold. They're not bold. I mean, if you gave me the pulpit for one Sunday, I would be throwing lightning bolts into the congregation, because this is the number one thing we ought to be talking about. So I think some of it is they're stuck in old ways of thinking. And I think they think people don't want to deal with this, but we do want to deal with this. So
Yeah.
I hope to be meeting or continue to meet with some of these people in the future and try to tell them it's okay to talk about what the Bible says about education.
Yeah. And the reality is, we've looked at some of the data from coming out of the Nehemiah Institute, just some of George Barna's research. The church in America is being absolutely decimated. People who hold the biblical worldview now are a tiny minority. And I submit that that's largely because of multiple generations of government so-called education. Kevin, we're down to about 4 minutes left. I want to ask about vouchers. You brought up the subject of vouchers. That's going to be a huge issue early 2023. We know a lot of Republican legislatures are going to be looking at ways to devise vouchers. And I think, for a lot of them, they're just thinking, how do we get kids out of these terrible public schools? We need to find ways to do it. But you are opposed to the government giving tax money to private schools, homeschoolers, et cetera. Talk a little bit about why.
Well, I do think that I have a concern about the civil government holding their umbrella and protecting, quote unquote, protecting private education. Private educated people do not want to be brought into the civil government sphere of influence, because over time, obviously, the civil government is not in the business of getting smaller. They're in the business of control and influence. And if you look over history, the civil governments are responsible for more death and destruction than any other group in mankind. But the primary reason, the threshold issue, and this is what I try to focus on with people, is even someone from Texas Homeschool Coalition that I was interacting with on this particular issue, and they're in favor of vouchers, by the way. They say, well, you need to show me evidence that the civil government is going to negatively influence homeschooling. I said, well, let's back up a little bit here. You're proposing that we argue over the public treasury. What gives you the God-given right to use force and coercion to take my money and give it to somebody else? So that's really, as Christians, what we need to be focusing on is not this hypothetical overtaking of private education, but really socialism. When you go to church on Sunday, you're saying impliedly it's okay for you to use the civil government sword, the power of taxation, to take money from your neighbor. And that's improper. And not only that, there are other peripheral issues like, well, in Arizona, for example, you're only going to get back 90% of your state income or your state tax dollars. Well, what kind of deal is that? I want 100% back. In fact, I want interest on that, because I know I would earn interest on it. But those are nuanced arguments. We're not used to thinking that way anymore. So it can be an uphill battle. I think in Texas here, we're about to do this battle. We're going through it now. I'm trying to educate some of the legislators. We only need to influence a few. But the bottom line, though, Alex, is when people talk about school choice, so-called school choice, as incrementalism, they're wrong. And here's why. Because school choice, whether it be a voucher or an ESA or education savings account or an empowerment scholarship account, or even a tax credit, those do nothing to alleviate taxes, civil government school spending, and civil government regulation when it comes to education. And those are the three mechanisms that we need to deal with, and school choice does nothing to alleviate those mechanisms, and that's why school choice is not incrementalism.
Yeah, and we end up getting the most kind of independent-minded individuals and families hooked on government welfare programs. Right? They become welfare queens. And we just saw it happen in Arizona. They passed these ESAs for everybody. A bunch of homeschool families took them, and they are now no longer considered homeschool families under state law. They are now ESA families with all kinds of government requirements. Kevin, we're out of time. We've got about 30 seconds left. What's the best way for people to find your book? Your books, actually.
So they can buy Abolition, Overcoming the Christian Establishment on Education on Amazon. And they can go to our website, deconstructingthecoliseum.com, to interact with us and just be involved in this great movement.
Well, Kevin Novak, we appreciate very much all your work. Thank you for coming on the program and sharing your insights. Hopefully we'll get you back on soon, maybe as this battle over so-called school choice moves forward. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank you all for tuning in, whether you're listening to us on radio or on any of our video platforms. I'm Alex Newman. This is Conversations That Matter. Until next time, God bless you all.
Imprisonment, forced labor, permanent separation from my family, perhaps death. I knew what could happen to people who were caught trying to defect. But the watchtowers stood yards away. The possibility of a new life in a different world, one without tyranny, was within sight. The West. I thought of the rewards no longer crushed under the boot of communism. I would work and make money, no longer restrained by the chains of collectivism. I would say what I wanted, without fear of spies and informants nearby. I would be free. The frozen rain and Romanian mud sipped through my gloves and cloths. I fantasized about the fire burning in the wood stove of my parents' home, but I pushed those thoughts from my mind, closed my eyes, and waited for the cover of the darkness.
Get Defector, a true story of tyranny, liberty, and purpose by Mark Hobafkovich with Paul Dragu. A thrilling page-turner that will remind you how precious yet vulnerable freedom is. Available at shopjbs.org or Amazon. For a limited time, get 20% off your entire order using promo code Defector20 when you purchase Defector at shopjbs.org.